Please remain standing. Thank you, Charlie. Because our speaker today happens to be a minister, he said he'd be happy to sing for his supper. We thought we would ask him to offer an invocation. Reverend Mark.
Let us join together in prayer. Almighty God, we're grateful for this moment of gathering which we have. Thank you for those who have served their country. We thank you for those who have sacrificed for us and for the blessings which we have around us. Grant to us peace of mind and peace of heart. May our lives be dedicated to the future of our children and our grandchildren. May we work together for the greater good for all. We ask this, we pray this in your holy name, and we say together, amen.
Amen.
Thank you. Before I formally introduce our speaker, I have a very pleasant duty to perform. I would like to introduce an old friend and colleague from the Massachusetts National Guard, Brigadier General retired John Carlson. General Carlson is very active with the Massachusetts Military, with the Military Historical Society of Massachusetts. He's a former president, and currently he serves as historian. And he would like to make a presentation to Chaplain Mark.
Well, it's indeed a pleasure to be here. I'm not sure I need this, but let's try it. Oh, well, I'll be able to settle down a little. The purpose of my visit is to present something to your speaker today, which I'm delighted to do. I've heard the good colonel in the past speak, and I'm sure it's going to be a good afternoon. Just about the Military Historical Society of Massachusetts. We have a splendid thing here. Gresh Lattimore, as a matter of fact, brought this in today. And it talks about the dates of incorporation and whatever. I think the important part of it is that the society exists in order to encourage the study of military history. It came about by its founder, through its founder. Actually, it was a gentleman named Ropes, John Codman Ropes, the co-founder of the law firm Ropes and Gray. His brother served during the course of the Civil War. He couldn't because of a deformity in his back. He was a graduate of Harvard, as you might suspect in those days, and had to learn about his brother's death at the Battle of Gettysburg, which I think stimulated him emotionally and caused him to just want to know more. And so this society really came and was born out of his concern and desire to know more about what the Civil War entailed. And later on, he added others. He wrote about 5 books on the Napoleonic Wars during his time. So he put together the society, founded in 1876, and then incorporated. It's the oldest incorporated military historical society in the United States. And today I'm here with great pleasure to present to your speaker, William R. Mark, Colonel, United States Army, retired. This, which is identifying him today as a life member of the society, and it's a gift to him from his friends and comrades from the Veterans Hospital, where he's done so much and so good work. So I'd like to present that to Bill right now.
Welcome aboard. Thank you, John. It means a lot to me. Thank you. I appreciate this. Before you go, I need to tell you that my uncle, my my mother's brother was the bandmaster of the First Corps of Cadets in Boston before the Second World War. And he became an Army bandmaster later in both World War II and Korea, and served right until 1966. And I have some wonderful pictures I think might be helpful, and John, you can help me direct them where they should go.
Surely.
Because they should surely go into a museum at this point in time. It shows the cadets in full uniform, the band in full dress uniform. Other pictures. I also am very responsive to what you said about the fellow who was touched by his brother's death at Gettysburg. I've done some family research on my own, my historical research, and I had a great-great-uncle from Maine named Parlin Crawford who served with the 3rd Maine, and then when his enlistment ran out in '64 at Cold Harbor, he went over to the 19th Maine and served the rest of his time there. But he at the wheat field was wounded and decorated with the Kearney Medal for Valor, which was given to the Third Corps soldiers in lieu of, this is before the Medal of Honor was out. And he received the medal and was promoted from sergeant to first sergeant. So I'm sure the casualties had something to do with that. But he fought in every battle except Antietam of the major battles of the Potomac, the Army of the Potomac, and went home with camp fever in 1864 and finally died in 1866 at age 26. And that was not uncommon in those days to see that many of the troops were killed because of the illnesses in the field. So I've been doing my own little historical research on my
Well, we'll gratefully accept the pictures, and our collection is located in the Mugar Library at Boston University, so that they're available. We're digitizing all of our information now so that we'll open the gates to the entire world to the information that we do possess. But
Thank you, John.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, General Carlson. Couple of housekeeping details. You'll see a basket with a little cash in it at the refreshment table. And that basket is an indication that we gratefully accept any donations just to help us defray the costs of our overhead and our operating expenses. So any modest contributions are gratefully accepted. Also, we always want to thank Starbucks of Lexington Center, who supplies us coffee for every one of our meetings. And the very tasty baked goods are always contributed by numerous volunteers. We have a delicious array every meeting. And thank you so much to everyone who supplies those. And now let me introduce our speaker, Chaplain Bill Mark, an ROTC graduate from Wake Forest University. Bill was commissioned into the Army Corps of Engineers in 1968. After a 2-year tour in Germany, he served in Vietnam as a district senior advisor for 4 Corps in Chau Doc Province. Then he returned to the States and served as a demolitions instructor and a company commander. In 1973, he felt the call to an entirely different way of life. He joined the reserves, and he enrolled in Lancaster Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania and earned a Master of Divinity degree in 1976. He then pursued advanced studies in clinical pastoral education at Andover Newton Theological Seminary. Excuse me. In 1980, he was branch transferred to the Chaplain Corps. He retired from the military in 1994 with the rank of colonel. Chaplain Mark has served as minister or youth minister at congregational churches in Southampton, Winchester, and Northbridge, Massachusetts, and as chaplain at a rehab and skilled nursing facility specializing in head injury and coma cases. In 1985, He became the chaplain at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Bedford. For nearly 30 years, he has served as chaplain and post-traumatic stress coordinator, screening combat veterans, determining treatment, and conducting individual and group psychotherapies. I believe we have a number of Chaplain Mark's friends and colleagues here from the VA hospital to cheer him on. Would those from the VA hospital just raise your hands so we can recognize you? Okay, great to have you with us. You are a testimony to the wonderful work done by Chaplain Mark. And now I'm going to let him tell you more. I give you Chaplain Bill Mark.
When I get an announcement like introduction like that, I feel like I should be taking a ball and tossing it into the air and see if I can catch it on my nose and people can applaud. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a joy to see many of you, and I've looked forward to preparing for this for a while because I know you want the latest information I have. We're going to talk about mental health in the military today and what we've learned from Iraq and Afghanistan. And this will be a bit of a summary as I do this. You'll have to forgive me sitting. I managed to fall down my basement stairs and do a job on my right leg. So I'm going to sit during this presentation, if you don't mind. At the end of the Second World War, people came home as was expected. You were told you'll come back when it's over there, as they said in the First World War. And people did come back. They came back to welcoming families and to a new life. And at that point, the country opened its arms and gave free education to many and really put our feet on the ground when over 16 million people came back. We didn't hear about the many psychiatric problems that went on in this country, that many of the VA hospitals were created simply to care for the wounded and for those who were mentally ill who came back. Did you know, for example, that a quarter of the military evacuations from the European theater were mental health evacuations? There were people who had emotional problems were brought in. 1/4 of all the troops flown back were plagued with these problems. It's not uncommon to see in a number of families who send a number of young people, a number of their young men come back with emotional distress, either from the Pacific theater or from the European theater. We weren't aware of it. I think there was a movie called The Best Years of Our Lives, which was done with Dana Andrews, if you remember that movie. And Walter Pidgeon, I guess, was one of the other actors in it. And it talked about the difficulties that they had in coming back. That was the film of the year, I believe, in that year, and people responded to it. But other than that, people were sort of expected to work their way into society. When the Korean War occurred, people came back, but they didn't exactly come back with great honors. They came back with a stigma. Many of the prisoners were called turncoats, and they came back from the Korean War distrusted, and there was a great deal of problems because a few people had been turncoats, had done propaganda for the North Koreans. They were considered, all of them were considered a raw group. I had a friend who came back who was from the 7th Division. He was a West Point graduate, class of 50. He lost his company command because he lost his security clearance. They took away all the security clearances on the officers who were in the prison camp. And it took him years to regain his security clearance again after exhaustive examination. When people came back from Korea, they came back quietly. They just came back and slipped in, and in many cases didn't tell people where they'd been or what they'd been doing. And I think some of you may be able to attest to that here today. When the Vietnam War occurred, we went through the most contentious period of our history
in terms of military service. There was a large population who said, hell no, we won't go, as opposed to those who went and those who were drafted who served. The war lasted for a long time. It lasted for about 15 years until it finally came to an end. When these veterans came back, they came kicking and screaming. They were angry, they were upset, they were hurt, they were on drugs, they were a mess. And we were angry and embarrassed with them, and such movies as Rambo seemed to dictate what a Vietnam veteran was like. So for that reason, many Vietnam vets didn't tell anybody they went through the Vietnam War at all. They kept it to themselves. They kept it silent. And when they wrote up job resumes, you didn't see that they were veterans on the resume. In 1981, the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder came to be. And that was a start at looking at the mental health of the force. In other words, why were these people doing what they were doing? Early attempts at treatment included group psychotherapy, which turned more to stir the sewer than to resolve the problem. In other words, the veterans came back and they would tell their war stories in the group, and they would get angry, but there would be no resolution for these situations. There was no exit out of it. So that many of them were stuck in alcohol and drugs, and it was a very difficult time for our country. We went through a period of time and still with them are working through the problems that they've had and trying to help them get their feet on the ground even today. I'm surprised how many veterans who are coming in from Vietnam who've never been treated. Right up till my retirement in June of last year, we had 2 or 3 people waiting to be processed coming in. And that's just one small VA hospital. Whoops. It is this process that has brought us to the Iran and Afghan war. We have gone into this war, and as I recall, in the first Iraq in 1990, 1991, as you well remember, when people came back, they were welcomed home, and people said, well, we don't want this to happen to these vets, what happened to the other vets, meaning the Vietnam War veterans. That people were really welcomed back from what amounted to a 100-hour battle. But it started to tell us that we had some problems in terms of what we were going to deal with the future. Along with Dr. Jessica Wolf, I participated in a study of 3,500 returning veterans who came back to Fort Devens and whom we tested with the best available models of psychological testing at the time to see how they were doing, and then followed them for 5 years and 10 years beyond to see how their stresses developed and evolved. And we could see there was a pattern. We could also see that the number of troops in special assignments was predictable. So in the first Iraq War, you saw helicopter pilots, you saw medical people who were handling casualties and bodies. You saw some of the armored cavalry units of the front of the screen of the Army divisions that went forward. The 2nd Armored Cav, the 3rd Armored Cav, experienced a lot of the combat, and the stressors from combat were there. They were clearly there. A lot of people were stressed out, but not the same as the intensity of post-traumatic stress disorder. We, for the first time, dealt with large number of women in the force. Originally in the Iraq War in the 1990-1991, DOD approved 15% of the force could be women in combat, in the combat zone. But they were reluctant. Many of the MOSs were closed out to women because they were not ready to process them and prepare them, and there was a great deal of congressional uproar because of it. So this was the first Iraq, and it mounted to, and we began to start to study the force. And the Army, it became apparent that they would do more than what they needed to do, and they began to study troops going into the field to deployments. So when deployments went out after 1994, people were tested prior to going out, tested after coming back, to see what kind of responses and how they'd changed dramatically in the process of that so that we could better understand how to help them when they came back. Part of the information they discovered, and we've not yet been able to get over, is the stigma that anyone who speaks up about a mental health issue encounters in the force. During the Vietnam War, it was my experience to serve under a major who committed suicide in the field. And one of my responsibilities was to remove his personal effects and to put his body in the body bag. And I never forgot that. I had seen him, he was my boss, I'd seen him within 45 minutes before this happened, and I wondered for years what I could have done or what I could have said. And it was not until years later that I discovered from our senior commander that he had been sent back from Vietnam 3 years previously because of mental health issues. He tried to kill himself with a rusty bayonet in the 25th Division. He'd been brought to Fort Ord. He had been given counseling, and then all traces of it had been erased from his records. And he was given a report that said he's completely fit for combat duty and sent back to us. And obviously he wasn't. There was a mistake made that night. We didn't find out until the next day it had happened. We wondered if that was it, but we wondered too if we'd failed him in some way. And it was only after 20 years that we were able to understand what had really happened and what had really transpired. Now we're in Iraq and Afghanistan. May I stop now and ask if you have any questions at this point or would like to share with us an anecdote or something of that sort? Yes, sir. Well, I'll catch up to that, and that's a very good question. Unfortunately, I don't have a good answer, but I will give you. I'll give you what they're doing right now. During the Iraq and Afghan war, mental health pretty much stayed the same way it was in the military system during the Korean War. During the Iraq conflict, mental health issues were something that they never seemed to catch up on or get enough of. It was stigmatized to have to get mental health, and even the medications were hard to find. It was not uncommon to see men who had to have a medication, and women, covering a 30-day period. They would have to go to a different part of Iraq entirely, sometimes 18 hours by convoy, to get their medication at the medication release point at Basra, then drive back to Baghdad and up to the north where they were assigned. Trying to find counselors to do the work, there were more patients than there were counselors available. So the Army recognized that as part of the services recognized they were flooded with the number of people who had mental health needs, and that they would need to have a larger proportion of forces put out for the care of the veterans during this time. It was not uncommon also to see with the number of women in the field, to see the problems that male and females were having in the field. A study was done from 2004 to 2007. There were 52,000 reportable assaults on women by soldiers. And also there were 44,000 reports of men who assaulted other men, and the same reason. So that we realized that we had some serious problems that we'd have to work with in terms of what they tried to do. This has gone along this way, and in 2007, the suicide rate became apparent to the military. There were 23 for every 100,000 in the service committing suicide on a yearly basis. Combat troops, people in the field coming in. Now, the average population in the U.S., similar to it, is around 10 per 100,000. That's a lot, especially when you consider that the military can select out many veterans who are many people who are inappropriate for military service. So the rate is a lot more alarming than it appears. I'm not supposed to say this, but the Marine Corps was 24% and the Army 23%, but I won't go into that. Yes, sir.
Studies differentiate at all to identify any difference in suicide rates between volunteers and draftees?
Is the rate different between volunteers and draftees? Is that the question? Well, in the Iraq and Afghan war, there were no draftees. This was an all-volunteer military force. There's no indication that there was a difference. There are a lot of questions around the age of veterans that come up. For example, the average age in World War II was what? 28. World War II was, the average age was 28. The average age in Korea was what? 24, close, 23, 24. The average age in Vietnam was what? 19. Why did they like 19 years of age? Because they're not formed. They're not mentally formed yet. And they're at a stage where they can be manipulated, can be motivated, can be pressured because they have no fear. They're not afraid of anything. So it was an ideal age to do it, but what they did was end up messing them up, seriously messing them up. And that became a great problem at the time that the veterans came back. They had no foundation. They had nothing to build on. They had no careers. They married because they were expected to marry. They didn't know why they married except that their mother and father wanted them married. And these things didn't work. In this war, we're still studying that question about whether the short-termers or the long-termers, and a short-termer is somebody like a National Guard soldier who went 2, 3, 4 times. I've seen veterans go to Iraq and Afghanistan as many as 7 times. And that's over a period of about, 2003 to 2012. They're constantly turning around. Families can't tolerate that. It's intolerable. I remember a veteran very clearly who told me that he came home after the second tour and found his bags packed on the front porch, and his wife said, "Have a good life." Families can't tolerate that kind of situation. And one of the questions I'll talk about that DOD is asking now and Department of the Army is looking at very hard is our reserve, active, and guard force appropriate for the kinds of wars we get into? Is this an appropriate way to man the force during these periods of time? The Guard are not designed to be sent into prolonged wars and then pulled back to the States. They can't come back to their old jobs the same way because the employers, if they're going to keep them, won't promote them. They'll keep them at the same level because they know they're going to lose them again. And if you had your own business, which is common, there were many entrepreneurs in the Guard, their business is shut down completely. Nobody could take them over. So they came back to get unemployment checks. So there are issues such as that have to be resolved. And they've already begun working on that about 10 years ago. And I wish I could tell you what the answer is, but there are a lot of possibilities, but there are no answers at this point. Does that answer your question? Is that okay? Does anyone else have a question? Yes, sir. I think that's been a lot of it. I think that yes. You were saying that you were in the service between 48 and 78, and that they came out of the families came out of the Depression. They came out of hard times. They remember families having difficulties, and they put themselves into it in a different way. And does it make a difference? Yes, it does. The largest drop rate in the armed forces today are what ethnic group would you say are the biggest dropout rate in the armed forces? Don't worry, we can use the word black, Puerto Rican. We're talking statistics here.
Minorities.
What?
Minorities.
Caucasians. They run home to mother. The black soldiers who are there, the Puerto Rican soldiers are there. This is their way of mobility. This is the way to get out of their problems, and they're there to do business. Their drop rates are less than 2%. Yes, sir? No, I mentioned 25% were combat evacuations from the European theater. Yes. No, I don't happen to have. I can find them out. We were looking at a comparison of a certain group, but I can find that out if you don't mind. I'll give me a little time to look it up. Well, let me talk about the 28-year-olds that come back. You notice I said mental health issues. I didn't say post-traumatic stress. When you see things like people who have bipolar or schizophrenic, that's the age pool that generally this comes out in. So that you'll see a person go along fairly well until 24, 25, and then they start to bog down. And you start to see people coming out with serious mental health issues that are psychiatric care issues. So that was the only group we had. Remember, we weren't studying the statistics then, and there was no work being done like it is now. So we're having to do a lot by conjecture. I want to just clarify thinking a minute here. There are two types of experiences that we have. One is anecdotal. An anecdote is one I talked about with my major who committed suicide. That's an anecdote. It's not a statistic. It becomes a statistic when you start to look at it over periods of time. How many of these kind of events do we have? Why do we have these kind of events? Are there certain patterns that come? So now as we begin to look at them, we see the suicides now today aren't all driven by combat issues. There may be family issues. There may be marital issues, problems at home. It's not uncommon to see a wife who leaves her husband and the man is in the field and he commits suicide. The husband at home and the wife is in the field, and the husband takes the children and moves back in with his family and telling the mother she's not going to have the kids anymore. I mean, they're very distressing things that come over. You have to remember that since the first Iraq, we don't have the Sullivan rule. It's not do you remember the Sullivan brothers? You couldn't serve in the same theater, right? That's all washed out. That's gone. That's not in the system or process anymore. So that you find grandfathers and granddaughters serving in the same unit. You find brothers and sisters in the same unit. You find mothers and sons serving in the reserve, in the guard. It's not uncommon to see this. So it's quite changed from what we remember the service to be like. Are we adapt to deal with it? Really not at this point. We're trying to get there, but we're learning a lot about this. But it's taking time for this to filter into the system. There's still a great deal of resistance to women in the combat arms. Although progress is being made, I understand that 3 women just got through the Marine Corps infantry program, the basic rifleman program, and they were certified. And they got through the Marine Corps program. Yes, sir. Yeah, we need more people, but we're at a time where the government is committed now to cutting back. That's been going on since 2008. The force is being cut back during this was talked about during the Bush administration and begun at that point. My son is a lieutenant commander in the Coast Guard down in Washington, and he's told me that the Coast Guard have already determined to cut back 800 this last year. Now, the Coast Guard is only 40,000, but it's typical of what's going on. They're starting to slice the force down. They are not using educational tools to recruit anymore. In other words, if your son wanted to sign up for the military, they would not be paying for his college education. And that's one way of slowing them down. We're still working on that. We're still studies are still going on in this. I took these 2 slices just as representative of recent material. Almost every week something is coming out. There are tests going on and material that's happening. One of these articles, and you'll get a chance to look at it, it's over there, is about Staff Sergeant Ty Carter. Does anyone know who Ty Carter was? Medal of Honor recipient at the Battle of Kamdesh. And in this report, he makes a statement. This was for the January issue of one of the magazines locally. He was interviewed, and he made these comments. What's going on through your head? He said, when good men are dying all around you, you have to start considering how you're going to die yourself. I told myself that if I run out of ammo, I still got my hands. I thought, if these are my last moments, how am I going to live them? Then he said, he was asked, what is it like to be presented the Medal of Honor by the President? Wow, when I was up on stage, I couldn't really enjoy it. Then I started looking out into the crowd. The pride and the joy and the emotion that I saw made everything, all the nervousness, worthwhile. Now that you're on a new mission to help veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, how do you feel? He said, part of the problem is that people continue to call it post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not a disorder. It's an instinct, a reflex of the body and mind. If we remove the D and get rid of the stigma, we'll start saving lives. And that's very true. People suppress traumatic events in order to function. They need help in unsuppressing them. If you go through a sequence of traumatic events, you need help at the end trying to process what these mean and what these mean to you specifically. We weren't able to do that. We need to be able to do that now and take the mental health stigma off it. You're not crazy. I've told that to many veterans, and I've said to them they're not crazy. They break down and start crying. I thought I was mad. My family told me I was a lunatic. My wife threw me out because I behaved strangely. And unfortunately, in some of these cases, it's too late to recover it. But we're still studying this problem, and we're still working on it, as evidenced by these comments. And I've talked to several other Medal of Honor winners about it. Yes, sir. Not that I'm aware of. That studies have been done on the North versus the South in Korean War or in any other war at the present time. I will tell you this. The Order of the Purple Heart has more chapters in what state? Alabama. That's a North Alabama, a northern state. But there are a lot of, you must know there are a lot of volunteers from Massachusetts. There were 227,000 people who listed Massachusetts as home who served in Vietnam. 227,000, that's a lot of folks. Yeah. We're now struggling to get into this war, very much into it, but post-traumatic stress goes back many years. In the Civil War, it was called Soldier's Heart. And it was called Soldier's Heart because the soldiers would start talking about their battles and they'd become very emotional and upset. And people didn't want to get them all worked up. They lived in the same community and they didn't want to get them all worked up. And their hearts started beating rapidly. And they had a lot of stress, obviously, from the battles. And so that was called Soldier's Heart at that time. In the First World War, do you remember what it was called? Shell shock, sure. There were some famous studies done by a German by the name of Goldberg at the end of the First World War of German veterans who had been pounded by artillery, and they were flipping all around. And Goldberg left Germany in 1928. He was a Jew, and they said, we don't want you. So he came over started working in Britain and started doing some studies that were there. And the British also did studies, and some of the American studies were done at that time, photographing veterans who were hearing loud noises, they recall. I remember two teachers in high school in Newton who taught me, and one was named Mr. Sherman, the other Mr. Holmes, and Mr. Holmes was named Shaky Sherman and Shell Shock Holmes. And I remember being cruel in those days, and kids would say at 10:15, we're going to drop our books on the floor at the same time and watch him go under the table. And sinful me, being 15 and not knowing any better, and I hope that both Mr. Sherman and Mr. Holmes have forgiven us at this point. But that was the degree of our understanding of it. And then there were parades for World War II veterans, and I remember those parades, and they were welcome back. And everyone, the World War I guys rode in the cars, and they came up in the vehicles. And I remember those days. And Korean units, some of them marched, but not many. Not many of the Korean vets marched. We're trying to catch up to these wars. There's not been a lot of psychological testing done before Vietnam. There were some studies after Vietnam that were done. There was a study in New York done in Washington done in 1987 looking at Vietnam vets had become twice symptomatic since they returned home from Vietnam. That was in a 15-year period. Homelessness was noticed as a major problem. Yes, sir.
Is post-traumatic stress more prevalent for the later wars than, say, for World War II? And if so, do you relate that to the country's attitude towards these wars?
Is post-traumatic stress more prevalent in these other wars or than in World War II? We haven't gotten into that part of it yet. Remember, this is a new emerging field, so we're trying to get ourselves moved into those areas. We're beginning to understand a lot more about it. I've talked with a lot of World War II vets as well, and not every unit went into heavy combat. Some of the Army divisions and some of the Marine units were terribly torn up in World War II. The third Infantry Division, the Rock of the Marne, had very heavy care. The 9th Division had a lot of combat time. The 1st Division had a lot of combat time. Units like that were expected to. Would they compare to the units in Vietnam, like the 1st Cav and the 9th Marines, who had the highest casualties for Army and Marine Corps of the Vietnam War? That's really hard to say. That's very hard to say.
I was wondering how much it was influenced by the attitudes of the country and the attitudes of the people as they went into the war.
I would imagine it had a big influence on the Vietnam War. I think people have felt better about the way they've handled dealing with Iraq and Afghan veterans. They feel better about it coming back. There's much more of an attempt. These woundings of IED devices are pretty grisly. These are pretty awful things, and I think people are very symptomatic. One of the things I found, and forgive my cynicism, but the worse you look as a veteran, the more attention you're going to get. The worse you seem to be disabled, the more you'll get people who will be concerned about you. And I hate to say that, but I've seen that prove true. Working with Social Security claims, working with different situations. If you look bad, if you look traumatically, if you come in looking like this, they're going to give you a lot more time and attention. But if the average combat vet comes in, he doesn't look like that. He looks like a fairly normal guy, and then you're surprised to hear he's been married 4 times. You're surprised to hear he's had 31 jobs. He looks normal. He looks good. But inside, he's really not very good. Yes, Dresh.
Bill, if that Medal of Honor winner made the comment, why doesn't DSM, the psychological group that puts together these, just remove the word disorder?
Why doesn't DSM remove the word disorder? Let me tell you. What is the purpose of DSM? It's a document that determines what a mental illness is. Well, dear friends, the DSM is not written for the doctors. It's written for the health community that are paying the bills. This is written for the insurers, so they'll have a category to put the problem under. So if it's a disorder, you'll get money to treat it. If it's not a disorder, they're not going to put any money into it. Post-traumatic stress, they can say, well, everybody has post-traumatic stress. Policemen have post-traumatic stress. Firemen have post-traumatic stress. We couldn't pay for all of that kind of treatment. And PTSD is pretty expensive stuff. A psychiatrist will be over $100 an hour. Over $200 an hour, actually. About $100 for a half hour. We're not going to pay for that sort of thing. That's what the insurance companies will tell you. Yes, sir. At all. And I was going to get into this a little bit later, but I might as well pick this question up now. The biggest problem that I can see that troops have had is dealing with Skype and emails home. I had a veteran who came in whose wife was on Skype with him every day. She insisted, and his mother was dying at home. And his wife would try to get him to make all the decisions that were going on at home. And he said, I couldn't focus on combat. I finally had to shut her off completely. And then she went to the Red Cross, went to her commander and said, why isn't this husband writing home? Why isn't this going on? Why isn't this taking place? And the husband said, I just can't take that kind of pressure. I can't deal with two fronts at the same time. And that's not uncommon. That's not uncommon. People want to have communications that are unreasonable. I recall back in the first Iraq War in Desert Storm, a young captain who was killed by his Jeep, and his driver had a cell phone. And so he took it on himself, feeling very bad, to call the wife and say, oh, Captain Jones is dead. He's been killed. He hadn't been dead 5 minutes, and she was talking to the wife. And the wife hadn't been notified by anybody or told by anybody. And he said, I'm sorry, I couldn't help her. And he started crying on the phone, and that was terrible disruption. And the command stepped in on that. But there are times when the command doesn't know about it. There's no censoring, by the way. Like you remember censoring of mail. You don't read anybody's anything now. Whatever goes out over the net. It doesn't, it's not kept quiet. If you put it on the net in any way, shape, or form, Facebook, guarantee you somebody will see it. Somebody will pick up on it. You don't have the privacy you once had. Yes, sir.
On the Iwo Jima, I had about a half a dozen men who backed up in combat,
Yep.
evacuated. My question is, afterward, did they have PSTD or temporary?
No, it could be it can be a permanent condition. It's hard to say at this point. It was certainly post-traumatic stress, but whether it was a permanent condition, it would be hard to tell from this point of view. I had a friend who was at Hill 881 South, was the company commander, and he had 4 of his troops taken off in straitjackets, and they put them on a helicopter in straitjackets. So it was not uncommon to see that. Is it permanent? It's hard to say, but I would be skeptical that they could have gotten the treatment they needed at that point.
I was curious about that. They couldn't move, you know?
Yeah. I've had those experiences in the field. I've seen troops that way in combat. I was the company commander at Fort Belvoir, and we had a lot of people coming back from Vietnam who were terribly traumatized, and who the trauma didn't break out until well after they got back. An anecdotal story from Iraq, the Iraq War. There was a lieutenant colonel who came to see me. His father had died in Texas, and he'd flown down to Texas. And while he was on the plane, he started to dream about and think about 2 soldiers in his command in Vietnam who were killed. And when he was sleeping on the plane, for the first time he saw their bodies. In memory of them came back to him. And he started crying. He started weeping copiously. He'd never grieved them before. So when he got off the plane, his brothers picked him up at the airport, and he was crying, and they presumed he was crying about his dad. And they tried to console him, and they tried to help him and everything. And he said at that point he didn't have the courage to say, it's not about Dad. Dad had a good life. He lived to be almost 90. He had a wonderful life, but this is about two young men that I couldn't save. I couldn't keep them alive. They died foolishly. And I was grieving them. Is that a natural response? Yes, it is. Many people may not have any flashbacks until they have this conversation with me today. They may not even think about it because they put it through a process and it's reached a certain place where it doesn't intrude, but it can come back. It's the gift that keeps on giving. Yes, sir. Yeah, the STARS program. Yes.
Addressing just suicide. You have it.
Yep.
Okay. And what that report says is some of the in civilian life.
Well, intermittent explosive disorder is more than bits of anger. Let me talk about this. I have a copy of that report. It's from the JAMA. It's actually 3 reports that are put together, 3 studies that are put together. Yes, it's dated 3 January. It's dated 3 March, and this is the report on it. And basically, it says suicidal tendencies are evident before deployment. Studies found. Amid growing alarm at the rate of suicide among members of the military and confusion about possible causes, researchers reported on Monday that most of the Army's enlisted men and women with suicidal tendencies had them before they enlisted, and that those at highest risk of making an attempt often had a long period of impulsive anger. Now, intermittent explosive disorder is not just, I'm a little bit angry. It's a rage in which people throw things, they become violently angry, they hit people, they get into fights. There's all kinds of violent behavior that goes on. But behavior like that can be wavered. Yes?
What the Army is how do we find those people before?
Well, a good study asks more questions than it answers. I was told when I started in post-traumatic stress disorder, well, I was asked if I wanted to make $1 million real fast, I could tell the Army how they could look at a soldier and say, this guy's going to have PTS. Isn't going to happen. Behavior really dictates certain things. And this study said that these people would be the kind of people who would, who might attempt suicide, might be more likely than others to attempt suicide, but it's might other than likely. They don't know for sure. They've got to do a lot more studies with it, and the study showed you need more studies. That's what a good study does, by the way. Creates more questions than it answers. You learn more about it. This is, we have some copies over there if you'd like to take a look at the end here. It brings together 5 years of work on an academic basis, and it's very interesting material. And this is the kind of thing that we're turning over now, we're learning about now. But it obviously means that we've got to pay more for attention to mental health than we are paying going into the service. You can't just have warm bodies. You need people who are going to be able to handle the traumas that they're going through, both the men and the women. There's no guarantee that there are going to be answers to these questions. And there's no firm guarantee that says we'll have less likelihood of it. They had a program that the Army used to try to harden up the force. It was called mental toughness. And they tried to do this program for 1,000,001 members of the Army, and the program basically didn't work. So the question is, how do we toughen the force to go through these experiences? How do we harden the force? And we don't know at this point. Yes. Well, that's the basic answer. Thank you. You're right. The basic answer is do we need to do a little more talking before we? It's easy to shoot. It's hard to do the talking. It's hard to work it through. We have to have the patience to work things out. Yeah. Yes. No, I'm there as a volunteer, yes. No. You're talking about target groups in the military for recruiting. Yeah, they are, and they prove to be more adaptive soldiers, and that's why they're popular. In other words, they're more able to deal with traumatic things because they've seen them before. So it makes them a high candidate. I'm not justifying this. I'm just saying that if you've had somebody who's been through traumas, it's likely that they'll be able to handle traumas better if they're able to do this. I can remember a black soldier in one of my units who said, hell, I saw worse than this in Detroit. Vietnam's nothing, man. I saw this worse in Detroit. Right, right. And you have to remember recruiting is like being a used car salesman. I'll promise you what you want. Just give me your signature. How many of you here were volunteers to the military, by the way? Okay. How many were drafted? Okay. You think it's different for you than for the guys who volunteered? Well, the volunteer was 2 years, and the 3 years, and the Marines were 4, weren't they? 4. 4 years, option 3 or 4. Yeah, they drafted Marines at one time into the military. They were so short of them, they drafted them.
Another category called obligated volunteer.
OBVs, right? Right. I recall that. Obligated volunteers. Yes. You had to complete whatever training you were doing prior to, but it was understood you could complete the training, but then you had to go in the service. And there you went, whether you wanted to or not. You were a done dog. I was an OBV. I know what you're talking about. I wanted to do something else at the time. I went in the service, and I said, "Can I finish my degree?" And it was in Asian studies, actually, at Yale. And I was going to finish the degree program down there, and they said, "Nope, we need you now. But we'll give you an offer. We'll give you 2 years in Germany, and you'll be a captain in Vietnam." And then they said, "Well, captains get killed less than lieutenants." True fact. Yes, ma'am. Good question. In our time, when we did the test during the first Iraq, we picked the most valid tests that were at the time of scores. We did the Boston signature test. We did some other tests that were appropriate for the time. Now I'm not sure what they're using for test vehicles, and I'm going to actually talk to a colleague about it in the next few days. I'm getting involved in this number study. Congress is still putting a lot of pressure on. The guy who's getting the pressure is the guy who's talking to me, and some of the issues there are scary that we're thinking about in terms of how do we sort them out beforehand, because a lot of people will conceal their behavior. They don't have to tell you what they've been doing or what they've been up to. If I'd been miserable, would I tell other people what I've been doing? I don't think so. I don't think I would. I wouldn't tell anybody anything about that. I'd keep my mouth shut. And that's exactly what they've done. Yes, sir. No, I don't think they've gotten that sophisticated yet. I don't think that would be much of an issue per se. I know that we're seeing that gay men and women have served as well as people who are not gay, who are heterosexual. And so I don't think that would be I don't think we'd see any difference in that. I don't think we ever have. I think the biggest thing I've seen are people who are surprised when they find out that so-and-so was gay or so-and-so was lesbian. They're quite surprised to hear that because the person was able to live a life that seemed very natural. And many people, they found they liked the person, they wouldn't ask them. They wouldn't ask them anyway. So I find that people are startled by that. My wife is an artist, and she paints down she has a gallery in Provincetown. And it's not uncommon for people to come in and ask her gender preference. My wife says that gives me an opportunity to say a lot of things. So she told her managers, just tell them what you think they want. What they want to hear, tell them anything. And we don't care. What do you care? Whatever feels good, whatever will market at the time. She doesn't care. She said, I know what I am. They don't have to know. So we work with it that way. It's been quite an education. We've had the shop 5 years in Provincetown. It's been quite an education for me. Being the old man that I am. Old fussy Scotsman. But we don't know that. Yes, sir, ma'am. My suspicion, and I'm talking as a minister as well when I talk about this, is that we don't want to pay the true cost of mental health that mental health requires. Many of these people that sleep on the grates, aside from being homeless, are mentally ill. And we don't provide the adequate facilities that we should be doing in terms of treating people with their mental health. I find that to be very discouraging. Many people need complicated mental health support. And you're told if you don't have money, it's really a chore to find help. And I found that to be very true. If you don't have somebody backing you, and many of these people are distrustful of the VA and have been given good reason to be in the past. VA care used to be throw a lot of pills at them and it'll make them better. And I've had veterans come to me with bottles and bottles of pills that have no validity or of no help at all for the veteran. They might as well be pouring them in the sewer. But they feel as long as they're throwing the pills at them. But now mental health is becoming more sophisticated in the VA. And a lot of veterans are saying to us, gee, if I knew the VA was like this now, I would have come sooner. But they don't. They take a bad experience they had with the VA, and that's it. Filing for claims is torture in the VA. People who have disabilities know they're going to spend months and months and years getting their claims through just so they can survive. I had a man who was 100% mentally disabled. It took him 17 years to get his claim through. By the time his claim went through, he was incapable of handling his monies. His monies had to be turned over to his daughter. Yes, sir. I'm not surprised. I could spend an hour and a half here telling horror stories of claims. It's so difficult to deal with. I would, yes, sir. They did about around the same time. The first VA was in Hampton, Virginia, and they were designed for tubercular cases. And they would take the guys out by the water. They would wheel them out in wheelchairs, and they'd be lined along the shore by Hampton. And that was the beginning of health care. But they took Lincoln's line in his second inaugural address about caring for the widows and the poor, and he who was born the cost of battle. And that was the beginning of the VA system.
Let me mention something, Linda, please. I'd like to mention about Pease Air Force Base, Pease greeters. I don't know if there's anybody here familiar with what I'm talking about. But a lot of the troops passing overseas and coming back are passing through Pease. And if you go up there once to greet the troops coming or going, you'll want to go again. The telephone number for the flights is 603, the area code for New Hampshire, 766-0502. 766-0502. And if you go up there and go north, you take exit 3 to get into Pease Air Force Base. And the greeters, the troops coming and going, it's a great sense. There's about 200 people show up, and they have a great sense of humor up there that they have this ceremony that goes on. If you want to greet the troops, it's not going to be much longer that the troops will be going back and forth, but it's a great experience to go up there to Pease Air Force Base. Has anybody here been to Pease? Anybody here been? Yeah. It is a great experience.
The man who heads that up lives in York, Maine. He lives in my neighborhood by chance.
But anyway, it's a great thing to do. Pease Air, 766-0502. And if you're going up there, keep calling that number because the flights change, especially when they're coming back from overseas.
They still do that in Bangor or not?
And Pease Airport, they do it in Bangor, but only 2 or 3 or 5 people show up in Bangor. But in Pease, hundreds of people show up. And they have a great ceremony coming and going for the troops.
These are the 2 handouts right over there on the table. So if you want to take a look at them, you might be interested. And always keep reading. There's more material coming out than we can keep track of. I just bought a sample from, this is just a 1-week cut of my reading list.
Thank you, Charlie. Are there any other announcements anyone would like to make? Yes, sir.
6 years ago, I'm Alan Blah, by the way. And I was
Yes, Alan.
6 years ago, we started a group to help veterans find jobs, and those veterans that have jobs, how to improve themselves. My business for 60 years has been helping companies grow the great people, and I've done it worldwide. So I've been pushing veterans, the administration. I'm trying to get people that will allow somebody like myself to pull in 2 or 3 people who've been in the recruiting business for veterans to help veterans find a job, help veterans who are working, how they can improve themselves. We were very successful. 6 to 8 years ago, we were down at Walter Reed, and many of the troops being left to go home, we would counsel them on how to do it, and they could call us anytime. Can't get through to these people. So much red tape, as we all know. So if anybody here, the general, the colonel, anybody that can give me a letter or something, say, we think this would be a good idea. And I've been to the VA in Boston, the VA in the North Fork area. I've had meetings with them. You know, it's like a lot of talk and no action. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Any other announcements of interest to the group? I have one announcement. Our next program is Monday, April 14. We have a terrific speaker. Hugh Buchanan was a POW in Vietnam for 6.5 years. He was shot down 1 month into his tour, and 6.5 years later came out of Vietnam, and he will tell us his story. So be sure to be with us. And now let's give a big hand to Bill Mark for a wonderful conversation. And thank you all for being with us.
Not with me, I'm sorry, I couldn't get you. Right.